Police officers are meant to stand between order and chaos, guardians of trust in our streets and our homes. But trust, once broken, leaves scars that never fully heal. Across US, a handful of women in uniform chose betrayal over duty, using their positions to manipulate, to harm, and to destroy lives they swore to protect. Their crimes shocked entire communities, their trials exposed hidden cracks in the systems built to shield us, and their life sentences serve as warnings that even among the trusted, danger can take root. These are the true stories of 6 female officers whose choices led not to medals or honor, but to prison cells they will never leave. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell to make sure you never miss the truth behind the badge. Case 1. Alfreda Fluca. For over 15 years, Detective Alfreda Fluca was a respected member of the Birmingham Police Department. She was known for her work ethic, her dedication, and the quiet professionalism she brought to every investigation. Her reputation as a seasoned investigator was solid, and she was trusted to work on some of the most difficult cases in Birmingham. She built a career on a foundation of service and duty, earning the admiration of her colleagues and the trust of the community. Yet, behind the uniform, Fluca's personal life was far from the stable, controlled image she portrayed to the world. Fluca had been involved in a turbulent, on-and-off relationship with fellow officer Mario Mays. They had known each other for years, working side by side at times, and developing a bond that was initially viewed by their colleagues as a standard professional relationship. But things began to take a darker turn as their relationship grew more intense, complicated, and ultimately destructive. Friends and colleagues would later testify that there were signs that Fluca's emotions were becoming difficult to manage. Jealousy, possessiveness, and erratic behavior began to overshadow the woman they thought they knew. In the months leading up to the tragic events of that night in April 2020, Mays and Fluca's relationship had been fracturing. Fluca's suspicions about Mays's loyalty began to consume her, especially when she learned that he was involved with another woman. Despite the complicated nature of their relationship, Fluca and Mays continued to interact, but the emotional toll of their strained connection was clear to those close to her. On the evening of April 2020, Fluca followed Mays and his new girlfriend as they left a local restaurant in Birmingham. The pair had been together earlier that night, and as they drove through the city, Fluca tailed them, unable to let go of the resentment and jealousy she had built up over the past several months. At the time, it was clear she wasn't just watching them, she was obsessively following them, unable to separate herself from the situation. As the night wore on, Fluca continued to follow Mays and his girlfriend, leading them to a remote parking lot near a commercial building. Surveillance footage from the area would later show Fluca's vehicle pulling into the lot behind Mays's car. At that moment, the situation took a violent turn. Fluca, who was armed, opened fire, shooting 15 rounds in rapid succession. The victim, Mays's girlfriend, was struck multiple times, the brutal violence overwhelming any hope of survival in the moments after the attack. Witnesses nearby reported hearing the gunfire, but were too far away to react in time. What followed was chaos. Mays, clearly shaken, immediately called for medical help as Fluca stood frozen by her vehicle. Surveillance cameras from nearby shops captured the moments after the shooting, showing Fluca calmly walking back to her car before being apprehended by responding officers. Body camera footage would later reveal her demeanor as officers approached her, unflinching and quiet. She was arrested on the spot, but the full scope of her actions was just beginning to unfold. In the weeks leading up to the trial, the investigation revealed the full extent of Fluca's anger and obsession. Prosecutors quickly painted a picture of a jealous woman driven by bitterness and revenge, someone who had used her training and access to weapons as an officer to carry out a premeditated attack on someone she saw as an obstacle in her personal life. They presented evidence of Fluca's past behavior, from messages exchanged between her and Mays to witness testimony that described her emotional volatility in the months leading up to the shooting. It was clear that Fluca had crossed the line, not only as an officer of the law, but as a person consumed by destructive emotions. At the trial, Fluca's defense team attempted to downplay her actions, arguing that the shooting was the result of a heated emotional moment. But the prosecution countered with the overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The deliberate following of Mays and his girlfriend, the multiple rounds fired, and the calculated nature of the attack. It didn't take long for the jury to reach a verdict. Fluca was guilty of attempted murder, with the victim's family speaking out in court about the emotional toll the incident had caused. In a shocking twist, Fluca was convicted of first-degree murder for the death of Mays's girlfriend. She was sentenced to life without parole, ensuring that she would spend the rest of her days behind bars. Her once promising career in law enforcement ended in disgrace, and her life, as she knew it, was over. At the sentencing hearing, the victim's family spoke about their loss. One family member, choked with emotion, said, "She wore the badge. She swore an oath to protect and serve, and she turned it all into a weapon against someone she was supposed to protect, someone who had nothing to do with her pain. We can't even begin to understand why. But we know this. She took someone from us, and now she must live with the consequences." As Fluca stood silently in the courtroom, facing the rest of her life in prison, the weight of her choices was clear. She had gone from a well-respected detective to a criminal whose crime was fueled by jealousy, revenge, and betrayal. Her story, one that once symbolized service and justice, would forever be remembered as one of tragedy, both for her victim and for the broken woman who could never undo the violence she unleashed. Case 2. Erin Sharma. Erin Sharma's career in law enforcement began with high hopes and dedication. She served as a federal corrections officer at the United States Penitentiary, USP, in Coleman, Florida, one of the most notorious high-security federal prisons in the United States. As a corrections officer, Sharma was tasked with maintaining order in a facility housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals. To the outside world, she appeared as just another member of the correctional staff, responsible for overseeing inmates, enforcing the rules, and ensuring the safety of both prisoners and staff. However, beneath this veneer of professionalism, a far more disturbing story was unfolding. Sharma's career took a dark turn in 2016 when she orchestrated the brutal death of inmate Richard Delano. Delano, serving time for a violent crime, was known to be a problematic inmate, but he had no history of violence that would indicate he was a threat to others. Sharma, however, had grown frustrated with him and made the decision to retaliate in a way that would forever change the course of his life, and ultimately his death. In a calculated move, Erin Sharma intentionally assigned Delano to a cell with an inmate known for his violent tendencies. This man, who had a history of severe aggression and brutality, was deliberately placed in the same small, confined space as Delano. For days, Delano was subjected to extreme physical abuse at the hands of his new cellmate. Sharma, along with other members of the correctional staff, turned a blind eye to the escalating violence inside that cell. Witnesses later testified that the abuse was ongoing, with Sharma aware of the situation and doing nothing to stop it. It wasn't long before the inevitable occurred. Inmate Richard Delano was found dead in his cell, the victim of severe physical injuries that included blunt force trauma. Despite the clear signs of an intentional attack, the prison authorities initially attempted to downplay the incident, calling it a prison altercation that had spiraled out of control. However, the facts soon emerged. Surveillance footage, testimony from other inmates, and an investigation into Sharma's behavior revealed the horrifying truth. Delano's death was not the result of a random fight, but the result of a deliberate act of malice orchestrated by Sharma herself. She had allowed, even encouraged, the violence that led to Delano's death. The trial that followed was a shocking turn of events. Erin Sharma's defense team attempted to argue that she was merely doing her job, that she had been unaware of the full extent of the violence. But the prosecution presented compelling evidence of premeditation. The assignment of Delano to a violent cellmate, the months of neglect and cruelty, and the deliberate inaction on her part as the abuse continued. They painted a picture of a corrections officer who had violated her duty to protect and serve, a person who had used her power to arrange the brutal death of an inmate in her care. The courtroom was filled with tension as witnesses recounted the abuse Delano endured in his final days. Inmate after inmate testified to seeing Delano's condition deteriorate, the once vibrant man reduced to a broken shell. The prosecution argued that Sharma had not only failed to intervene, but had actively contributed to Delano's suffering, creating a scenario where the victim was trapped in a violent situation with no hope of escape. The defense, in a last-ditch effort, tried to deflect responsibility onto the chaotic and dangerous nature of the prison system, but it was clear that this was no simple case of institutional failure. This was a crime that had been planned, carried out, and concealed by an officer who had taken advantage of her position of power. The jury did not take long to deliberate, and Erin Sharma was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a harsh reminder that those who are entrusted with power, especially in the prison system, must be held accountable when they abuse that power. Sharma's fall from a respected officer to a convicted murderer was swift and unforgiving. During the emotional sentencing, human rights advocates were quick to speak out about the broader implications of Sharma's actions. One advocate, who had worked closely with prison reform organizations, said, "What we saw in this case is not just an individual failing, it's a symptom of a much larger problem within our prison system. The level of cruelty and neglect that happens behind bars is often hidden from the public eye. This case highlights the dangers of a system where those in power are allowed to act with impunity." Sharma's actions were a direct result of a culture that fosters brutality, where the lives of inmates are treated with disregard. We must do better. The victim's family, though devastated by their loss, expressed their hope that Delano's death would not be in vain. They hoped that the trial would serve as a wake-up call for those working within the correction system, urging reform and better accountability to prevent such tragedies in the future. In the end, Erin Sharma's story is one of power, corruption, and the ultimate cost of abusing that power. Her actions didn't just end one life, they exposed the cracks in the prison system where corruption, negligence, and cruelty often go unchecked. Now, she too will live out the rest of her days behind bars, facing the consequences of a crime she orchestrated with cold, calculated intent. Case 3. Ashley MacArthur. Ashley MacArthur, a former crime scene technician with the Escambia County Sheriff's Office, shocked the community and the law enforcement profession when she was convicted of the brutal and calculated murder of Taylor Wright, a 33-year-old private investigator and former law enforcement officer, whose life was tragically cut short after she entrusted MacArthur with $34,000 to safeguard during her divorce proceedings, only for MacArthur to steal the money and later murder Wright when she attempted to retrieve the funds. On September 8, 2017, after Wright reached out to MacArthur to reclaim her money, MacArthur invited her to meet, lured her into a trap, and, with premeditation, shot Wright to death. And instead of reporting the crime or attempting to cover her tracks in any other way, MacArthur used her professional knowledge to carefully orchestrate a series of deceptive actions to hide her involvement, including depositing the cashier's check made out to Wright into her own bank account, spending the stolen money to fund her own lifestyle, and purchasing large quantities of concrete and potting soil the day after Wright's disappearance, which was later discovered to be used to bury Wright's body on MacArthur's family property in Cantonment, Florida, a fact that was eventually revealed through surveillance footage of MacArthur buying the concrete and soil, coupled with her increasingly suspicious behavior and contradictory statements to law enforcement regarding Wright's disappearance, in which she claimed that Wright had left her residence but failed to explain the evidence pointing directly to her as the perpetrator. When investigators combed through the evidence, it became clear that MacArthur had meticulously planned and executed the murder with the intent to cover up the crime, going so far as to use her position within law enforcement to mislead authorities and avoid suspicion for as long as possible, but her lies unraveled as investigators continued to probe into her financial dealings and actions following the murder, ultimately leading to the discovery of Wright's remains under concrete on MacArthur's property, which conclusively linked MacArthur to the crime scene and sealed her fate. In August 2019, after a highly publicized trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including MacArthur's fraudulent financial activities, the surveillance footage of her suspicious purchases, and the physical evidence tying her to the burial site, and the jury convicted MacArthur of first-degree murder, ruling that the crime was premeditated and that she had intentionally and with malice aforethought murdered Wright for personal gain. On October 25, 2019, Judge John Simon sentenced MacArthur to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Taylor Wright, additionally sentencing her to 7 years in prison for her role in a separate but related scheme of racketeering and organized fraud that involved stealing from other individuals in a similar fashion, and in April 2021, after MacArthur appealed her conviction and sentence, the Florida First District Court of Appeal upheld the jury's verdict, affirming her life sentence and further cementing her role in the murder as one of premeditated violence motivated by greed, ultimately ensuring that she would spend the rest of her life incarcerated at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida, with no chance of release, marking the conclusion of a tragic case that exposed the dangers of corruption within law enforcement and the devastating consequences that can result from the betrayal of trust, as MacArthur's actions not only ended the life of an innocent woman, but also shattered the reputation of the very profession that MacArthur had once been a part of, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow for Wright's family and friends, and a cautionary tale of the lengths to which an individual can go to betray the trust of those around them for personal gain. Case 4. Stephanie Lazarus. In 1986, Stephanie Lazarus, a former Los Angeles Police Department (LAPD) detective, committed a heinous crime that would remain unsolved for more than 2 decades. At the time, Lazarus was a 27-year-old, highly respected officer with the LAPD, but she was also emotionally entangled in a complicated and dangerous love triangle. She had been in a romantic relationship with John Rutan, a man she deeply cared about, but he had ended the relationship and married Sherry Rasmussen, a nurse who had quickly become the love of his life. Lazarus, unable to cope with this rejection, harbored a deep resentment towards Sherry, and this emotional turmoil ultimately turned into deadly obsession. On the night of February 24, 1986, Sherry was found dead in her apartment, brutally beaten and shot multiple times. At first, the crime appeared to be a burglary gone wrong, but detectives struggled to piece together the evidence. As an experienced LAPD officer, Lazarus was initially assigned to help investigate the case. However, the investigation was soon compromised by her secret involvement in the crime, as she had been the last person to see Sherry alive. Over the years, suspicion surrounding Lazarus's involvement continued to grow, but no solid evidence could conclusively link her to the murder. During the investigation, Lazarus even spoke with colleagues about Sherry's death, all the while presenting herself as someone deeply concerned about the case. She even attended the memorial service and expressed sorrow, all the while hiding her deep-seated jealousy and hatred. The breakthrough in the case came in 2009 when the Los Angeles Police Department's cold case unit decided to revisit the case and re-examine the evidence. One crucial piece of evidence had been overlooked: a bite mark on Sherry's arm. In 2009, forensic scientists were able to use advanced DNA analysis to match the bite mark left on Sherry's body to Stephanie Lazarus, a crucial link that had been missed during the original investigation. Lazarus's DNA was found on the victim's body, and she was arrested in 2009 for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen, more than 2 decades after the crime was committed. The trial began in 2012, and Lazarus was charged with the first-degree murder of Sherry Rasmussen. During the trial, it was revealed that Lazarus had stalked Sherry and had even gone to her apartment prior to the murder, making repeated attempts to contact John Rutan. It was also revealed that Lazarus's obsession with him had driven her to increasingly erratic behavior, including threats and confrontations with Sherry. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Lazarus continued to maintain her innocence, claiming she had no part in the murder. Her defense attorney argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, but the jury was unconvinced. After a lengthy trial, Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The judge noted the cruel and premeditated nature of the crime, emphasizing the emotional and psychological torment Lazarus had inflicted on both Sherry and her family. Stephanie Lazarus's case is considered one of the most high-profile cases involving a female police officer committing a serious crime in modern history. It exposed a terrifying reality. Even those sworn to uphold the law can fall victim to obsession, jealousy, and uncontrollable emotions that lead them down a dark path. The case was a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked rage and the dangers of corruption within law enforcement, as it involved a trusted officer who used her position and knowledge of the law to avoid detection for years. Stephanie Lazarus's arrest and conviction shocked the city of Los Angeles and the police community, leaving many questioning how such a respected officer could commit such a heinous crime. Her case also highlighted the importance of forensic advancements in solving cold cases, showing how modern DNA testing techniques can bring justice even after decades of silence. Lazarus's story serves as a cautionary tale, illustrating that no one, not even a trained and experienced police officer, is immune to the destructive power of obsession and the devastating consequences that can follow when personal feelings overpower professional duty. Case 5. Antoinette Frank. In the early 1990s, Antoinette Frank, who would later become one of the most infamous female criminals in U.S. law enforcement history, served as a New Orleans Police Department (NOPD) officer, but her time in uniform would end in a horrific act of betrayal and cold-blooded murder that shocked the entire nation and forever tarnished the image of the police force. Frank, who joined the department in 1993 after barely passing her psychological evaluations, some of which had flagged her as emotionally unstable and unfit for duty, nonetheless managed to get hired during a period when the NOPD was desperate for recruits. From the very beginning, she exhibited troubling behavior. She was often disrespectful to her fellow officers, reckless in her duties, and known to form inappropriate personal relationships with criminal elements. Her erratic performance should have raised serious red flags, but in a police department already riddled with corruption, she remained in her position without proper oversight. Antoinette Frank's descent into criminality intensified when she became romantically involved with a much younger man, Rogers Lacaz, a known drug dealer who was just a teenager at the time. Despite the glaring conflict of interest and criminal implications, Frank not only maintained the relationship, but also actively assisted Lacaz's criminal endeavors. She even allowed him to ride along in her patrol car during her shifts, granting him access to sensitive information and providing him with the protection of her badge and authority. Their toxic and dangerous alliance would eventually culminate in one of the most brutal crimes New Orleans had ever seen. On the night of March 4, 1995, Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacaz targeted the Kim An Vietnamese restaurant, a business where Frank had worked off-duty as a security guard. She was familiar with the restaurant owners and the layout of the building, making it an easy target in her mind for a quick robbery. Armed and prepared, Frank entered the restaurant after hours, accompanied by Lacaz, intending to steal the day's cash earnings. Inside, they encountered Ha Vu, Quang Vu, and Officer Ronald A. Williams II, a fellow NOPD officer who was also working security that night. Without hesitation or mercy, Frank and Lacaz unleashed a terrifying spree of violence. Frank personally shot and killed Officer Williams' execution style, making her one of the rare police officers in American history to murder another police officer in cold blood. After shooting Williams, Frank forced her way into the restaurant's freezer, where she executed Quang Vu and Ha Vu, two young members of the family who owned the restaurant. She left their bodies inside the freezer, believing no witnesses would be left to tell the story. However, another family member, Kim An-vu, managed to survive by hiding and later escaped to call for help, leading to the beginning of Frank's undoing. When responding officers arrived at the scene, Frank brazenly attempted to insert herself into the investigation, pretending to be a concerned officer who had stumbled upon the crime. She fabricated a story about witnessing an unknown assailant fleeing the scene. However, the inconsistencies in her story, coupled with the surviving family members' testimony and overwhelming evidence, quickly unraveled her lies. A thorough investigation revealed that Frank had stolen Ronald Williams' service weapon after murdering him, and that she and Lacaze had planned the robbery and murders together. Ballistics and forensic evidence tied her and Lacaze directly to the crime. In the subsequent trial, prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of Antoinette Frank as a corrupt, greedy, and deeply disturbed individual who had violated every principle of honor and trust associated with the badge she wore. Witnesses testified about her increasingly bizarre behavior leading up to the murders, her obsession with Lacaze, and her desperate need for money, which ultimately motivated the robbery and killings. The prosecution emphasized the calculated, cold nature of her crimes, arguing that Frank had exploited her position as a police officer to gain access to the victims, betray their trust, and then systematically execute them. In 1995, a jury found Antoinette Frank guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death and sent to death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, Louisiana, making her one of the few women on death row in the United States. Despite multiple appeals over the years, her conviction and death sentence have been upheld repeatedly. Rogers Lacaze, her teenage accomplice, was also convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The murders committed by Antoinette Frank were particularly shocking, not only because of their brutality, but also because they exposed the severe flaws within the New Orleans Police Department's hiring and oversight practices. Her case became a glaring example of what can happen when psychological evaluations and red flags are ignored in favor of rapidly filling police rosters. It also reinforced public fears about police corruption and misconduct in a department that, even without Frank's crimes, was already under federal scrutiny. Today, Antoinette Frank remains one of the most notorious examples of law enforcement corruption and betrayal in American history, a stark reminder of the potential for evil even among those sworn to protect and serve. Her actions destroyed multiple families, disgraced a department, and left an indelible scar on the city of New Orleans. She awaits execution after decades of legal appeals, serving as a grim symbol of justice delayed but not denied. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more real crime cases and deep dives into justice and betrayal. Stay informed. Stay aware.